on the 25th, announced that the nuclear portion of the AUKUS deal was going to be upheld. It sounds aspirational to me, but it could be that the 4 years we'll go through the motions. But I think it takes two to tango. Now, I know the Australians welcome this comment, and they're very pleased. But there is a matter of whether or not they can do what we're having difficulty doing, and that is making submarines. And as a practical matter, it's very important to understand when to fold. Now, that it may not be now, it may come later, but if I was a betting man, fold we will. And the question is how and what should we not fold? We've been meeting. I suppose we could keep meeting. But I think with the new administration, it's for someone else to do the meetings. I think we've covered most of the topics associated with AUKUS and what I would describe as Pax Americana, or in the Pacific, and the idea that perhaps this arrangement with the US, UK, and Australia should be expanded to include, at least in some fashion or another, the Japanese and South Koreans. Now, when I say this arrangement, it probably would not be the nuclear submarine portion, which has not really done that well or progressed that much. And I think is still in question. So my better half, at least with regard to this forum, has bothered to go to Australia and try to find out more about how the Australian system is likely to be able to cope with future military and defense collaboration, much less submarines. And that's Brian Clark. Now, I think you all know Brian if you've been here at all. And I think it would be useful to get, if you will, a trip report of sorts from Brian. Again, I mean, it could be we're wrong that the submarine thing will last and go to fruition. But I think we need to be turning on our headlights a bit now. I did notice that the president has yet to say the word AUKUS since his new incarnation. I think that tells us something as well. It cannot be that high a priority item for him. But in any case, Brian, I'm going to hand it off to you. I think this will be the last meeting of our AUKUS group, which has met now since AUKUS was launched. I want to say that was in 21. So that's 4 years. And, and to everything, there is a season. We gave it the office on this. So over to you, Brian. Tell us what you've learned and what you think from what you've learned, where AUKUS may be going, despite brave words about not changing anything.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Henry. I'm glad to be doing this with you, and it's good to see you again. I hope you're able to hit the slopes today.
I did.
And I'm glad we're able to continue doing this effort. We'll see, if there's interest in it down the line, but I think for now we can sort of close out this chapter of it, at least with this discussion. So to give a little background, we are at the Hudson Institute are doing a study on force design in the context of a tabletop exercise series that we're doing. And in that, of course, is baked in this whole discussion about what is it that we need out of AUKUS. Some insights in terms of what technologies that AUKUS Pillar 1 and 2 could provide might be most beneficial for the security problems they're likely to be faced with. and the constraints they're under are pretty substantial. I mean, I think everybody kind of knows that the budgets are tight. Different governments are going to have different priorities, but I don't think there's any government on the horizon that's going to substantially raise defense spending in Australia. Personnel is a huge limitation. We found that in some of our analysis, personnel ended up being the limiting factor in terms of force design. So I want to talk a little bit about what we kind of think the opportunities are in AUKUS through the lens of this tabletop exercise series, because it gives you an operational perspective of what maybe is most valuable for Australia and what might drive their thinking in terms of what they would want from AUKUS, as opposed to what the UK or US might want to push to them. Because when it comes down to it, the budgets are going to be so limited in Australia that they're going to have to establish priorities and make choices. So I've got some slides to help with this, as you can see, and we'll send these out after the fact. I won't go through them in gory detail, but it's to kind of provide a sense of how we're viewing this and how we're working with them. I wouldn't say this is the Australian, but this is our view, and then it's what's reflected is Australia's interpretation of what we've presented to them. So we're doing this war game series or tabletop exercise series with Japan, Australia, and the US. And we started with a Japan game in July of last year. We did this Australia game in October. We're doing a US game in March, and then we'll do another game in the summer all three of these countries are involved in all the games. So it's been a multilateral effort each time. And the scenario we're working with is this basic one that's on the screen now, which is this blockade of Taiwan that becomes protracted. And then the allies have to kind of band together to establish a counter blockade to try to pressure Beijing to relent on poor little Taiwan. The counter blockade then is a forcing function for what these countries need to be able to put forward and what they need to do in terms of military operations. The counter blockade idea also is a good stressor because it requires the same kind of capabilities they would need for their own homeland defense. So Japan and Australia would both need to be able to do things in the first island chain to protect themselves. So whether you call it a blockade or a counter blockade or just homeland defense extended, the capability implications are likely the same. But you can see here, Japan, the US, and Australia kind of all get a piece of the geography. And so in each game, we play this whole scenario, but we view it from the lens of each country's particular interests and kind of let the other countries be non-player characters, if you will, in the game. And so looking at the Australia portion of this, what this ends up being, so Australia's military ends up being pretty much entirely consumed with what we would call extended homeland defense. So trying to establish some kind of cordon out at the Indonesian archipelago and out at their extended islands, so Cocos and Christmas on one side, out towards Papua New Guinea and the Solomons on the other. And then they have a homeland defense consideration that's closer in, but they have to have this extended homeland defense in order to have any hope of really protecting Australia's shipping lanes, access, important cities and bases, because otherwise their military is not big enough to cover all the ground that needs to be covered. And we presented to them in the game the threat of we'll just call it red, but it's China. But the Australians did want to get into a whole discussion about, is this China or is this just some other adversary, which I think is a good point, that any adversary could present a threat to Australia. So the red side is threatening mostly missile attacks against Australia, launched from ships or from bombers. If you're talking about China as the adversary, it's difficult for China to get anything other than bombers down this far away from China because of a lack of aerial refueling capacity. So it's a threat that is mostly the missile threat, and then there's also some submarine threat to shipping lanes because we can imagine that red would deploy some of those far south, as you can see on the chart. And so one thing that jumps out of this right away, and we found in the game as well, is that the air environment around Australia becomes pretty permissive because of the distances involved. So the Chinese can't reach Australia with substantial or any fighter coverage, and their ships are going to have limited air defense coverage around very local areas. So there's not much that the red side can do to impact Australia's airspace. So Australian aircraft can operate relatively unimpeded. Their ships and unmanned surface vehicles don't need to worry about being attacked by aircraft generally. So it means it opens up a lot of options for how you would do missions like anti-submarine warfare or surface warfare or strike, because you can use uncrewed surface vessels or ships in environments where if you were the US trying to do this up closer to China, you would have to use submarines to do a lot of those missions. So that means for the submarine, the Australia's nuclear submarines, the question is, well, what is their utility? Because you don't need them down by Australia to do the homeland defense mission. In the tabletop, the teams did use them if they were in the right place at the right time to conduct attacks against red surface forces mostly. But for the most part, they weren't an essential element to that air defense, surface defense, and also anti-submarine warfare campaign, because it was cheaper and more efficient to do it with aircraft or surface vessels, which you could use easily given the permissive air environment. But the ways that you could use submarines would be in an offensive manner. So you could go after red targets to try to get them to back down and threaten red bases, red shipping, red naval forces up inside contested areas like the South China Sea you see here on the picture. But what this requires is a willingness on the part of blue, in this case, Australia, to be able to execute those kinds of offensive operations. So in the tabletop, we didn't play this out because we didn't include these offensive operations necessarily as something that we demanded them to do, and the teams didn't come independently to the conclusion that they needed to do this. But for the Australians to pursue the SSN as a pretty substantial investment in its future force, it's going to have to start to think through these use cases of where the submarines are most valuable. And given the scope of the threat from a country like China, you will have to probably use submarines to be able to provide some kind of threat of retaliation that Red will have to consider credible. And it could force Red to back down, because in a lot of ways, the Australia part of this campaign for Red is somewhat discretionary. So Red could say, well, we'll call it a victory and we'll focus on what we're doing up here with Taiwan and the US and Japan for the most part. So you have to create that logic or that incentive on the part of Red to leave blue alone in this case. But that's something that I think is challenging for the Australian government to state as a potential use. And so it's hard to square that circle. So when they make the case for the submarine, they are having to make that case based on a set of missions that, when you really play them out on a tabletop like this, they don't seem to really demand the kind of capabilities that an SSN provides. The missions that do require that are the missions they don't want to talk about, I think, as much. But this is like the essential paradox, I think, with the SSNs. So not to say that the SSNs aren't a good investment, but they are a good investment if you're willing to use them in the way that they're most valuable. And then looking out at kind of pillar two, so pillar one being the submarines, pillar two of AUKUS being the uncrewed systems. Uncrewed systems ended up being very important in this tabletop series because these countries are all faced with manpower or financial or both limitations, and uncrewed systems allow you to scale in a way that allows in such a way that the cost does not scale linearly with the number of vehicles, and also the personnel don't scale linearly with the number of vehicles. So you can grow your force and get more coverage without having to blow your budget or recruit an kind of unsustainable level of personnel. So thinking about the Australia case here, what they're doing is essentially extended homeland defense, which means you need to push some kind of air defense umbrella as far out as possible so that you can perhaps prevent red bombers from being able to get to the weapons release point where they can launch missile attacks against the northern approaches of Australia. So the blue side pushed air defense systems, basically ground-based air defense systems, north into the Indonesian archipelago, sometimes ashore because in parts of the tabletop, we allowed them to have access to Indonesia. And then in other parts of the tabletop, we took away that access and they had to put these systems onto uncrewed surface vessels and send them forward. And then you have some kind of small manned contingent, some small crewed vessel that was providing the command and control for that operation. So this gives them the way to stretch out that air defense umbrella and also gives you a way to establish a little bit of a perimeter. And the way that the teams ended up organizing their forces were in this idea on the right of pickets, pouncers, and protectors. So a lot of uncrewed systems acting as pickets to sense incoming threats, pouncers to high-speed things that can go after targets. And then the protectors are all the crewed stuff, and that is staying at home for the most part to protect Australia's home territory. These are the big missile defense ships. These are the ones that are going to be probably better suited to large volumes of fire. So they're going to catch the leakers essentially that come through the first lines of defense up here to the north. Also, it allows you to keep those crewed platforms more survivable so that they're less threatened by bombing attacks, for example. And then a couple of things to note interesting here were one, deception becomes a very important element for each of these countries. We found in these games that even with uncrewed systems, you really just can't cover all the territory you need to cover. And if you want to present to Red the potential that they can't get through this barrier, you might have to put a bunch of decoys or simulated systems or emulators that go out there and provide the signature of, for example, an air defense system, so that Red has to now guess, is this real or is this Memorex? And am I going to chance it or am I just going to go through there and risk getting attacked? Then the other part that we looked at is this idea of collaborative combat aircraft, which is a popular technology that's being pursued in the US, Australia, and Japan. And we found that those are most useful in these kind of long-range kill chains that you have to execute to get to bombers before they can get to the point where they can launch land attack cruise missiles. And that ended up being the main use of them, but they were valuable for that. So there was a lot of demand for those in the game. And then the last thing here on the last slide is the teams end up, as a result of all this, and we gave them a chance at the end to kind of rebalance their forces based on what they'd learned. They gravitated towards uncrewed systems that were large enough to carry small uncrewed systems, essentially, so they could push these guys forward, and then they could deploy smaller uncrewed systems and keep some kind of presence out there that didn't require a large number of people. So that the takeaway from all of this suggests that for Australia, Pillar 2 is extremely important. And when we are doing the force structure analysis now to say, how do you pay for this? We found a way to pay for what you saw on the screen there with some relatively modest changes to the rest of the force structure that the Australians are pursuing and keeping the submarine investment. So the Pillar 2 investment, though, needs to be prioritized. I think, but unfortunately, it's the Pillar 1 investment that's become the highest priority. But I think we saw from the tabletop that the Pillar 1 investment in submarines is valuable in a wartime context if you're willing to use it as a potential offensive capability against an opponent. But if you want to deter conflict, you need to talk about using that in peacetime, or you need to talk in peacetime about using it in wartime. And we haven't seen a willingness yet on the part of the Australians government or officials to make that kind of threat or make that kind of claim as to why they would need a nuclear submarine. So given that, we think that the relative priority between the submarine and uncrewed systems in Pillar 2 probably needs to shift. Now, in terms of what's likely to happen, I think you're going to see governmental changes in Australia that could, over time, reduce the support to Pillar 1, the Pillar 1 investment. And you could see some kind of hybrid approach eventually emerging where U.S. bases nuclear submarines in Australia, but in the western part of Australia, at the Strategic Rotational Force West, and then maybe you get up with some Australia-U.S. crewed submarines, but that maybe Australia doesn't buy any U.S. submarines and then moves right into SSN AUKUS when that becomes available with the U.K. Just because I think there's going to be pressure on the budget. There's going to be pressure to deal with the threats posed by China in ways other than just buying SSNs. And we can find ourselves having to manage a hybrid submarine force down in Western Australia. And I can talk more about some of the other challenges that I think are going to drive us in that direction of maybe having this hybrid force as opposed to having a purely Australian sovereign force with Virginia-class submarines.
Before we begin with open comments, and please, I think we're small enough you can raise your hand. I think Caitlin can keep tabs, order of battle. Let me ask a question. How important in achieving the missions of keeping China from misbehaving militarily, and for that matter, other ways, is it to pick up on the suggestion that was made but never followed through on of expanding Pillar 2 activities at least to Japan and South Korea in a more vigorous way than we've done to date? I realize this is not part of the game, but you're an informed person.
Well, that was part of the game. I mean, as part of this project was by looking at all three countries and looking at their uncrewed systems. What's the options there? I definitely think so. With Japan, uncrewed systems make a huge difference in the ability of Japan to survive in that environment and be able to counterattack against Chinese forces. So the uncrewed systems are essential to China or Japan having that ability to survive long enough to retaliate. For Australia, as you can see from the tabletop and our other work, the uncrewed systems are important to defend Australia, but not so much in terms of being able to pose a substantial enough threat to China that they would, maybe back down. So I think for Japan, it's much more important to deter China, but for the Australians, this is more about just having a credible ability to defend yourself. And the submarines are really the method they would have to use to be able to retaliate against China and maybe deter Chinese aggression. But that only works if you're willing to actually talk about using it that way.
And South Korea, which is very keen always to get a nuclear something and fill in the blank, but this, from now it's nuclear submarines. How does that work? Because what we're seeing now is the entertainment by Australia of, I forget the class, I want to say frigate, but maybe it wasn't, from Japan. I can easily see South Korea being solicited as well for some kinds of vessels. They have shipbuilding. But how does it work? Where does South Korea fit in all this, or does it?
So South Korea, I think, is mostly focused on the U.S. market because I think they see it as more lucrative because Australia doesn't have that much money, right? So I think for Japan and Korea, I guess Korea is looking at the U.S. because they're looking at it as a lucrative market. Japan is looking at Australia because they see them as having this relationship they want to foster. So when I've talked to officials in Japan and in Australia, they're trying to foster the, I want to say alliance, but the relationship, the partnership between Australia and Japan. And they see the Mogami, the follow-on class to the Mogami frigate, as a tool for doing that. And I don't know that Japan's really looking at it as a big money-making opportunity, although it could be. So for the Japanese, they're going to already build this advanced frigate, and they're basically looking for the Australians. If they wanted to buy 6 or 12 more, then that just adds more units. So it will be a moneymaker to help them amortize some of their investment, but it's mostly, I think, about the relationship.
Okay, well, we should probably open it up now.
May I tell you?
Yes, you're welcome to ask a question.
Actually, Japan has a beta experience with Australia in the submarine business. And I think that was 2018. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe told me privately at his residence that the Prime Minister Abbott, Tony Abbott, had promised Abe to import Japanese submarines from with the no bid contract at their meeting in October 2013. But, however, the changing with the Prime Minister, the Australia changed from Japan to France. And so because of the difficulty is their Australians of they have a very strong workers union, and also they have some regulation of protection of their, that is the regulation of offset program, and it's very complicated. And also French lost their business in Australia. So I think and also regulation is they cannot import finished product. They have to participate to producing product. So I'm very negative to do business with Australia.
Okay.
But on the other side, the intelligence of Australia on China is very important, and a very unique information intelligence they have. And from the view from a different dimension. So we need a cooperate, of course, with Australia. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I see so many names of people here that I'm sure, given their past activity in writing, should be asking questions or at least giving short speeches of some sort. This self-restraint is just not characteristic of this group. Mr. Cooper.
Thanks, Henry. Brian, really great presentation as always. I find it quite convincing. I just want to ask you if you can maybe build on either this project or work I know you've done elsewhere, and talk a little bit about what you think an unmanned undersea option would look like for Australia that would have been useful in this game, but would have been better tailored to Australia's needs. And I ask that because, as you know, I think where this is going to end up, and I've thought this since the day that the optimal pathway was announced, is that the Aussies are going to kill phase 2 and probably phase 3 of Pillar 1, or that we will help them kill it, and that they will end up having some uncrewed option as a replacement. And so I'm wondering what that uncrewed option should look like if you were able to design it for the needs of this game. Thanks.
Yeah, great question, Zach. So yeah, I agree with you. I'm talking with the Australians. When I was down there, I met with the Australian Submarine Agency as well. And it doesn't seem like phase 2 and phase 3 of the optimal pathway are really getting the kind of preparation they require. If you think about what would be necessary to stand up naval reactors in Australia, and what would be necessary to build out the whole maintenance infrastructure you're going to need for nuclear submarines. I mean, I still see the kind of urgency of all that stuff.
You surely are not violating the acronym rule here, but you are probably, for some, speaking in code. I bet you I could guess what phase 1, 2, and 3 of Pillar 1 was, but maybe could you break the code for us just in case I and others would guess incorrectly?
Yeah, so phase one is essentially what's happening now, which is you're seeing more U.S. submarines operating down in Australia out of Stirling, and UK submarines are in theory going to be operating out there more frequently. And then phase two, I think, is we set up so we do that. We set up this strategic rotational force, and we establish a set of submarines that are operating out of that area. Not based there, but operating on a longer term basis than just on a regular deployment. So there's a continuous submarine presence down there that's US and UK sourced. And then phase two is where they buy US Virginia class submarines at $3 billion a pop, and taking those out of the operational inventory of the US Navy. Which is 3 to 6 submarines between like 2032 and 2036 or so. And then phase three is the SSN AUKUS, where Australia and the UK build a new submarine that replaces the successor to the Astute class, and it's purpose built for their needs. Because arguably the Virginia class is not the ideal submarine for what Australia would want. So that's the three phases, and they stretch out into the 2040s. And Zach is saying phase one is what's happening now, and will go obviously till 2032, is building out this permanent presence of submarines out of Stirling that are composed of US and UK submarines. We've already got submarines operating out there. There's already Australian sailors starting to operate off of US submarines. So you'll see that grow, this idea of a hybrid force, essentially, that's got Australians and US sailors on them. And the Australian sailors are getting trained here in the US, and obviously they're US submarines, so they're getting managed and overseen by US organizations. But I'm just not seeing that kind of effort into Australia to really stand up the kind of infrastructure, personnel-wise and material that you would need to host or to have a nuclear power program in the Navy. But it could happen. But I think going back to Zach's point, so if they do decide to sort of let things peter out after phase one, so you've got this permanent presence of US and UK submarines, there's Australian sailors on it, you say, well, that's pretty good. That's a submarine presence that can act as a deterrent. The US might be more willing to use them offensively than the Australian government might. So they might actually constitute a more credible deterrent than an Australian sovereign submarine would. So Australia then could complement that with uncrewed systems. So in the game, or the tabletop exercises, we have been playing the Ghost Shark, which is a undersea vehicle that's autonomous, that you can be of various sizes, but it's essentially the size of a 20-foot shipping container. So it can carry mines, it could carry sonar systems, it could carry little torpedoes. It may be able to carry missiles, but not very long ones. And if you carry long ones, the mechanism to deploy them is very difficult. So what I think, if you wanted to design something that would replace phase two and phase three, it would have to be a larger version of that actually could carry missiles. That seems to be I would think that's going to be the key capability for Australia to have, is this ability to send something forward that could launch missiles and attack some target ashore as a way of retaliating more or less with impunity. I mean, you're not going to be able to really do much about that. So I think that something more along like a version of Ghost Shark that's more like a wider diameter. It's almost the diameter, it's almost the size of a diesel submarine, but autonomous and uncrewed.
I think people who are not in the government any longer need to remember they're not in the government any longer. You still have your First Amendment rights. Yes, Adam.
All right, Henry, you've shamed me into it. And as usual, I listen to my shipmate Brian and agree with just about everything he said. And Zach's question goes right to this issue. Brian mentioned that, hey, in Australia, they're just unwilling to say that the SSN is not a good investment. So we need to double down on that issue and remind them that for Australia, the SSN is not a good investment, that phase one is exactly what pillar one should be. And I've imagined for a moment that I'm a US 7th Fleet commander, and would I want some operational capability out of Western Australia that I have the option to use? Yes. And can it benefit Australia? Absolutely. But the real legs to this effort are, as you pointed out, Henry, in pillar two. I mean, we just had last week DeepSeek kind of as a catalyst. This is what is it? Andreessen called it a Sputnik moment for big tech. So autonomy, AI, collaboration has an urgency that we've got to just say, hey, wonderful, SSNs are great, but they're a niche capability, all right? And so I think the war game brought all that out. Interestingly enough, I had an opportunity to spend some time with my old boss a couple of weeks ago, General Jim Mattis. And he and I actually mentioned AUKUS. And his comment I thought was appropriate. He said, Robert, at the end of the day, it's 3 words: alliances, alliances, alliances. As to the extent that AUKUS can help us with alliance maintenance in pillar one, great. But let's be realistic here. The best you're going to do at HMAS Sterling is for the Australians to be a better host to SSNs. The notion that they're going to go build one, I spoke to the Submarine Institute of Australia in 2023 down in their conference in Adelaide. And, I said, hey, it'll help your educational kind of motivations to build more engineering expertise, and their universities are quite good. But this notion you're going to go spend money and try to build an SSN with the UK, that is absolute folly. The timing is such that it's so far out there, the world's going to be completely different by then anyway. And so I just thought the way Brian's war game got after these issues, and Henry, notwithstanding your reference to Ecclesiastes, I think that this is absolutely the right focus, the takeaways from this war game. Again, it's not that I don't love submarines. I've spent probably more time than anybody on the planet operating nuclear submarines in the Western Pacific. So great, but that's a niche capability for a specific mission. And I think Brian just nailed it as far as what's in the best interest of Australia. And then how does that go to this issue of better alliances with Japan? And you mentioned South Korea. I think there's room there in pillar 2 of AUKUS for both Japan and South Korea. So I'll leave it at that, and then I'll just kind of sit back and listen. Thanks.
Now, I see certain people who served in previous administrations in the US, and also people who have written as if they were supporting administrations, and mostly, as I look at the roster here, Democratic ones. Are there not anyone amongst you that have anything to say about the future of this proposition, which was launched, under President Biden? I mean, apparently, when I read the article about Mr. Rubio saying, well, I've talked with the Prime Minister of Australia and we've decided AUKUS is a go on submarines, it noted that President Trump has not yet said a word, as if, it's still contingent. I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, perhaps Mr. Rubio has a phone connection to the White House and maybe he speaks to the president. I don't know. But how do the people who have worked in Democratic administrations see this? Is this a partisan issue? What is this?
Mr. Einhorn?
Mr. Einhorn, just
Yeah.
one of the people I thought might have something to say.
Can you hear me, Henry?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. So I don't have any comments or questions on Brian's characteristically excellent presentation. So this may be far afield, but maybe you could help me, because I haven't tuned into this issue for years now, but I'm interested in one aspect of it, how it's played out. And back in, when it was it, 2021, I was in touch with you, Henry, on this. There were concerns from a proliferation point of view, and that AUKUS's boost for nuclear submarines was going to lead to greater interest in nuclear submarines elsewhere under less than adequate safeguards, and could lead to be a stepping stone to proliferation. Have we seen any of that? Has it given a boost in any country that we're aware of to the idea of nuclear submarines? Have the South Koreans been more outspoken recently? What has it made for Brazil's program and others? And what has the interaction with the IAEA been on this? Have they figured out how to do this in a credible way? I know these questions are far afield,
No,
but I'd be interested in Brian or Henry or anyone else who might
we
enlighten
have
me.
some Koreans here. We have some Japanese here. They may be able to speak to at least what's going on in Korea. And we have two submariners who probably know a little bit about Brazil. The other, the other long stretch was Iran, which I think still is a long stretch. But the other activities were in play even before, which were India. And so where any amongst you foreign experts who are foreign, do you have anything to say about what the level of intense interest or intensity of interest in South Korea is for nuclear submarines? Has it gone up or down, or is it just in the background chugging away?
Henry, this is Inbound.
Yes,
I'm sorry I'm not putting my camera on. I don't have my makeup on, so
that's all
please.
right. We can imagine you with a cape on.
Thank you. So overall, the Koreans right now are really interested in getting their own nuclear weapons, especially because of Mr. Trump and all the possible things that could happen. One of which is a direct negotiations with Mr. Trump's friends, Kim Jong-un. And just the other day, Mr. Trump said Jong-un is a smart guy, complimenting him, and then the comments about as if acknowledging North Korea as a nuclear weapon state by not only Mr. Trump but by Hegseth and Rubio has made a lot of Koreans jumpy, and the indigenous nuclear weapon proponents have really are pushing this. And as an extension of this, there's a vocal voice, which I am really concerned about, for South Korea to have nuclear propelled submarines. And so those factors are getting more interest right now in Korea with the new U.S. administration. I'll just leave it at that.
Ambassador Abe, I don't want to put you on the spot, and you can blow this inquiry off if you want to. I respect the discretion. Is there any sentiment that's being expressed beyond those that were raised briefly by former Prime Minister Abe before his assassination, by anyone in Japan that counts for anything, or if anything, has interest in things nuclear, at least in public discussion in Japan, gone backwards since then? Do you have a sense?
I haven't noticed any discussion of nuclear submarines for Japan. I think Japan will be the last one if it does. For the defense of Japan, you don't really need the nuclear submarines. Japan has excellent conventional submarines, very quiet, long-lasting, and so for the defense of the seas nearby Japan, Japan does not need one. And decades ago, Japan had a commercial nuclear-powered vessel.
Yes, Maru.
And unfortunately, when it was on an experiment trip, it had a radiation leak, and Japanese people all jumped up and they stopped the project. So there's a strong aversion against any nuclear-powered ships in Japan. And so I think there will not be any chance Japan to get nuclear submarines.
Okay.
And personally, I don't think South Korea needs nuclear submarines. They just need to defend their seas nearby. For that purpose, you don't need the nuclear submarines. Well, in fact, as In Bun has just told, there is a discussion in South Korea to get nuclear bombs for themselves. Well, it's understandable somehow, but again, I don't think they need it. Think they can trust Americans in that sense. Thank you.
Okay. Any additional rejoinders, comments about Brazil? I mean, I'm not privy to what the progress is on Scorpion project in Brazil. Is it like Brazil itself, ever present as a possibility but never realized? What is it?
So I did go down and checked out the nuclear program and the submarine program in Brazil with the CNO back in the day. And they clearly saw it as it was an industrial policy effort more than it was anything else. So the feeling on the part of the leadership in Brazil was, we do this not because at the end of the day we get a nuclear submarine, but we create all the infrastructure, the science and technology, the industrial base that makes us better in a variety of technology areas. And we may have the ability to export some of these technologies in the form of other products. But since then, in tracking it, it's really sort of fallen in terms of progress. There's been a lot less investment in it. Some parts of it have been entirely shut down. So I would say that program is more or less in some kind of deep freeze and unlikely to result in a nuclear submarine in our lifetimes.
In our lifetimes. Now, in my lifetime, that may be less interesting. But your lifetime, you're a little younger. Okay. Yes, Admiral.
Yeah, Henry, Brian just reminded me of one thing, and that was a conversation I had when I was back in Australia as I was talking about AUKUS. And it's clear that a part of the political landscape in Australia, their interest in AUKUS Pillar 1 and nuclear submarines is really all about civil nuclear power. How do we use this to just get our foot in the door, because that's really where we want to go. Brian's more privy to the internal politics now than I am, because I haven't been back there in a couple of years. But that's one thing to keep in mind a lot of times in these various countries, and Brian pointed out in Brazil, the nuclear submarine discussion is kind of almost diversionary because, hey, there's this bigger slice of the civil nuclear aspects that they're going after.
Yes, well, I guess there's an election that will determine how much more we're going to hear about that. By the way, I think nuclear submarines, to me, knowing what I know about the electrical supply systems of major places, including Australia, strikes me as far less ambitious than a nuclear power program. I don't think they understand that. We're not exactly zipping ahead with our small modular reactor program, last I checked. It should have been here by now. It's not. It will be though. It's right around the corner. Yeah. So I don't know how that works. When is your election, Julia? When is the election? You know?
It'll be around about September. Round
September.
about September. So
Oh.
it's not fixed. It still will have to be called by the government, but we're estimating, yeah, September, October this year.
Now, is it the case, which my wife's Australian, and so she says, well, you know, the way the elections go is we've had enough of these folks. It's time for a change. Is that the way this is going to work, or is it really contingent?
It's very contingent.
Oh,
I
really?
think it's fair to say that both sides are much closer than perhaps they are, you know, in other countries. And there's so many different issues all mixed in together. You can't really say one thing rather than the other. I think at the moment our current PM is not polling so well, but that could equally change dramatically by September. And interestingly, of course, the leader of the opposition has been a previous Minister of Defence. So in fact, in terms of approaches to things like defence, they are very, very different.
I see. And I take it they're both parties are quite keen on the nuclear submarine for whatever reasons. Am I right?
I would say that the current government is keen from the point of jobs, is not keen, I think, from a philosophical point of view. But also, Australia being Australia, once it has got into a partnership, it is very difficult for it to make a decision, or, you know, like not partnership, but a program or commitment or whatever it is. Very hard for it to resolve from it, except obviously if it's with the French. That was an entirely different.
Should we just simply send people from the United States that have mastered French and have them just speak French instead of American to usher this along? I'm kidding, of course.
Yeah, I think we have a major personnel problem in Australia. Like we have an absolute, you know, lack of people who either you want to work in defence or have the qualifications to do the engineering required. So I think most people are sort of happy with the, yes, let's make Sterling available and just keep it rolling along. You know, from a public point of view, not a defence view. Like, okay, it's happening over there in WA. Yeah, it's giving jobs to Australians. We're kind of satisfying that arrangement that we've agreed to. It looks okay.
Okay, well, there you have it.
Yeah, so Henry, I'll just bring it to the some brass tacks. The one of the challenges we had when trying to come up with a force design for 2035 or into the future was the number of people you need for the nuclear submarines is so much compared to what they're currently using in the Collins class that becomes a limiting factor. Is there aren't enough people anticipated to be willing and able to serve that you could crew up the submarines. So you'd have to be taking personnel off of other jobs. So that was a problem we ended up running into. Money aside, and then the money was another issue. That this, for example, buying these tier 2 frigates from Japan or wherever, that's going to be difficult given the investment they need to, or that they're expecting to make in Pillar 1, purchasing the submarines in the 2030s. So I think all of those things could come together and make it easier for the government to make the decision to just stretch out phase 1 sort of indefinitely. And that goes to Zach's point of, okay, well, you could do that. Then do you have a risk mitigation strategy to address the retirement of the Collins class, which will be essential at, in that time frame? You're not going to be able to extend their lives anywhere past the early 2030s.
See that the Australian Navy is 16,000 members strong. What does a nuclear program like the AUKUS program require?
Well, I mean, the personnel associated with one submarine, just direct and support personnel ends up being about 450 people. And then you've got this infrastructure overseeing the nuclear power program beyond that. So you're talking very quickly. If you talk 3 to 6 submarines, you're talking 2,000 people just for the ships and the like rotational base that you need for them, that without even getting into the people that are necessary for maintenance or support or oversight.
That sounds like a large number. Yeah.
There's
Okay.
a question, Mr. Nishida.
Sure. Yes. Open up your mic. Please speak up.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Yes.
Just yeah, just regarding Japan, I just wanted to add a bit to Pastor Abe. Yeah, I agree with him, and just wanted to remind that I was reminded that during the election of the president of the LDP, the ruling party of Japan, Mr. Kono, who used to be a very strong candidate for the president of the LDP.
You may need to speak up a bit. The connections.
Oh yeah. Can you hear me now better?
Yeah, you need to take on your American persona and be loud.
Okay. Yeah. So Mr. Kono, who was one of the candidates for the president of the LDP during the election last September, he raised the issue of the need for a discussion that the self-defense forces have to possess a nuclear submarine. And of course, it was denied by the government at that time. But and Mr. Kono is a very strong pro non-proliferation politician. He's against the Rokasho processing plan, and also, but he's very pro on this nuclear submarine issue.
Yes.
And but of course, he lost the election, but he used to be one of the strong, candidate for the next generation LDP prime minister. So, yeah, so I just wanted to back that up. Thank you very much.
Yes. Well, thank you for refreshing our memory on that, because I remember posting his statements when he made them on my Twitter account, thinking that was pretty interesting. I take it once he lost the election, no one else has been uttering that in Parliament or publicly that has election certificates. Am I right?
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Not in the mainstream media, but I think it's still lingering in the right-wing sort of.
The rightist like that. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's not nothing. I mean, they're 10 to more than 10% of the electorate. Oh, okay. The way this works is when you run out of things to say, we stop.
Hey, so Henry, one other thing I was going to bring up is this question of AUKUS and Pillar 2 and the different countries. And to give you a sense of some of the dynamics, so Australia is constrained in how much money it has as long as it's continuing to buy the Pillar 1 submarines. If it did decide to forestall that and kind of push out phase 2 and 3, that frees up a lot of funding that in theory could be applied to Pillar 2 uncrewed systems, hypersonic missiles, those kinds of things, which would create a demand signal that might foster more of an industrial base in Australia, because there are companies that are building uncrewed systems there, but they're mostly aiming at the US market or the Japanese market than their own market. Also, with Japan increasing its defense budget, it's becoming an attractive market for uncrewed systems. And then the US is clearly buying more uncrewed systems, and the new administration is likely to accelerate that. So there's going to be a large market for the kinds of Pillar 2 capabilities that AUKUS is supposed to be sharing. And Australia and the US are both developing them, and Japan is not yet developing them. So Japan might be a customer initially. And then the US and Australia are probably going to supply predominantly domestically initially due to ITAR constraints. And then maybe there'll be more sharing as they work those through the export control reductions that are being implemented right now. But the dynamics of the Pillar 2 industrial base, the opportunities are pretty big. There could be a substantial market for these kinds of systems between the AUKUS and JAWCUS allies. And it sort of depends on who's going to be in position to take advantage of that market when it materializes. Because I think in the early 2030s, when Zach Cooper's idea of pushing phase 2 out into the future happens, suddenly there's going to be a lot more money coming towards Pillar 2. And I think some companies could be well positioned to take advantage of it.
Well, Melissa's comment comes to mind. Someone might need to sharpen their speculative pencil. And here's the thinking. Oh, but we get into nuclear, we get into a civil nuclear program, and then we get into enrichment of uranium, and then we make money exporting this. Now, I spoke to one of the commissions at their request and argued that if you can't get private money to make money, the idea that government can invest in things to make money is an interesting but not very successful proposition historically. And I don't know what they did with that. I think they buried it as a footnote in their commission report. But I said, you really have to have the idea that governments do well developing items for commercial export. There's just not a lot of good examples of that anywhere. But that doesn't mean it doesn't appeal. But presumably, it would be nice to know what this market for Pillar 2 items might look like. I don't know how you do that because it's pretty speculative, isn't it?
And so right now, that market is mostly the U.S. And the investment it's making through things like Replicator and other initiatives. So that's in the billions right now, going towards Pillar 2 kinds of capabilities, mostly uncrewed systems. I won't get into I don't think hypersonics is necessarily a good example just because the technologies are generally not shared very well. And then Japan is probably going to spend, if they're supposed to double their defense budget. When you look at that, at least the numbers we came up with in our force design analysis suggested that in the next 10 years, they might spend 4 trillion yen on the uncrewed system, Pillar 2 kinds of capabilities. So you're looking at billions between the US and Japan.
NATO, Europe? Is that a market at all?
NATO's not been very aggressive in pursuing those uncrewed system opportunities. And for the most part, they're doing it domestically. It has not been despite Ukraine's example, we have not seen NATO countries really embracing a force design that incorporates a lot of uncrewed systems. But the market could be very large. Right now, Australia's companies that do these systems are mostly looking to sell into the US and Japan, which will be challenging. Initially they might get some opportunities, but when Japan builds up its own industry, those opportunities might close because they'll look to build domestically.
Well, then you pinpointed an issue that you need to think about how to articulate with a little bit of increased volume, which is there could be alternative futures and alternative risks and regret. In other words, well, okay, you get this, but then you might lose that.
Right.
I think that if it's an argument that can be made, it should be. If it's not plausible, you shouldn't push it.
If Australia transferred that investment in Pillar 1 submarines into Pillar 2 uncrewed systems, it could jumpstart its domestic industry in a way that would allow it to sell into the US and Japan to a greater degree than they're probably going to be able to now.
I see. Wow. Silence is not golden, but it happens. I say going once, going twice, going 3 times. They say virtual reality is most vibrant within the first 60 minutes. We're going past 60. We may be going beyond virtual reality. I do think Brian and I have come to the conclusion that our collaboration in holding these meetings is going to give way to other ways to talk about the end of the world or saving the planet. But we might, Brian, think about whether we want to, exploit your expertise to write something brief, to kind of capture some of what was said by you and others here. And on that note, we have and will be engaging all of you in other activities at NPEC, and we hope to stand up something, if it gets funded soon, where Brian and I will be sallying forth in yet a new direction that I think all of you will be interested in. I won't speak a word about it till there's a nickel on it, and there isn't yet, but I'm optimistic there will be. So I'll get back to you all on that. Brian, stay online. I'm going to bid everyone else farewell, and thank you, for coming all the way from around the world. I mean, it really is impressive. I'm thank you for taking the time to tune in. I really appreciate that. That's a vote of real confidence. It makes me think we're doing something right.